Hello everybody, this is Paul B, and I need to interrupt this two-part series, Scientology Clips Confirm Minnesota.com, with some breaking news that is extremely important to every American, including all those Americans outside of Minnesota. This last weekend, when I was creating part one of this series, along with the rest of the country, I was blindsided by the unexpected and untimely death of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Scalia, which, of course, is very convenient for the Obama administration. I want to say right from the very beginning, this has really nothing to do with politics. I have to talk about politics here, but as I said in my last video, my emphasis is cult mentality, which is dangerous, not politics. But politics comes out of cult mentality. And if you don't understand that, we're just going to have this butting heads of right versus left until the end of time, and we're going to get nowhere. And while we're fighting this all out, the country is falling apart around us, and we're taking the rest of the world with it. You know, if you look at all of my videos and my website, Meannesota.com, 1996 is when I began my Third World American project. That's when I began warning that we were headed in this direction. I warned of the economic collapse that finally hit in 2007 or 8, however you want to interpret it. I warned of information sciences being used long before anyone conceived of the Patriot Act, information being used as a weapon against the American people, government beginning to take control over people in a totalitarian sense. You know, I began warning about these things in 1996. And nobody wanted to hear it. Now everyone's crying out about it. So, that was 10-year project, Third World American. The 10 years after that, I spent dealing with Minnesota, which is the topic of this YouTube channel and my website. I have said all along, with confidence and frankly with authority, that Minnesota is the most dangerous cult in the United States of America. In the last video, I said that the only cult mentality that rivals it in terms of its threat to all American people is what I called liberalism, and perhaps I should have said leftism. I apologize if that's incorrect, but where do you draw the line between liberalism and leftism, progressivism, whatever they want to call it this month? You know, the problem is the ideology, the cult mentality that leans in that direction. And this isn't something I've ever talked about publicly before. I did a bit during Third World American, but the time has come, and here's the reason. Because, you know, right now it's the middle of the night, and I'm in my car. There's no way I'm going to be able to sleep tonight because A, the cold, and B, what I just saw on a newspaper headline on a freshly delivered newspaper to a gas station. The headline said that Minnesota U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar was being considered to fill the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court that has opened up with the untimely death of Justice Scalia. Now, again, I have said all along that Minnesota is the most dangerous cult in the United States of America. The reason for that is because it is the only cult in America that elects its own representatives to the federal government, where those individuals, people who represent the character, the behavior, the attitudes, the beliefs, which includes malignant narcissism, passive aggressiveness, lying and deceit, sociopathology, all of those things are represented by the representatives in federal government of Minnesota. And the reason isn't because of Minnesotans, it's because Minnesota is dominated by the cult of Minnesota. That's the dominant subculture here. And the crud rises to the top. First place they headed was to the government. That's why the state legislature here in Minnesota is something that brings me to tears. The idea of putting a Minnesotan on the Supreme Court. If you think that me having everything I worked my entire life for taken away from me, left for dead, living in a car in a Minnesota winter is bad, consider the fact that, as I've been pointing out over this entire ordeal, not one person in a position of authority in Minnesota, which is dominated by Minnesota, has even attempted to do anything about it. In fact, they spend more time and effort trying to shove it under the rug to make sure nobody finds out what is happening to me. That's what they're suggesting to put on the U.S. Supreme Court when they suggest putting Amy Klobuchar there. I have seen Senators Klobuchar and Franken from Minnesota. Those are the two United States senators. I have seen both of them in action. They visited my workplace. And that's your first clue of what you're dealing with these people. The reason that the only time I've seen them face to face is in my workplace is because they like to address people in workplaces, because you can't, it's not just politically incorrect, it's career suicide for you to challenge them there at your place of employment in front of your employer. Because the reason that they're there talking to your employer is because your employer is trying to lobby them to serve your employer's interests. So if they come there and your employer is trying to lobby them on their behalf, and then you sit there and ream them a new asshole and you point out their hypocrisy and their contradictions and their corruption and their stupidity and their ignorance, you're going to lose your job. That's why these people like to only address the masses at something like a political rally where there's so many people that nobody can address them publicly, or at a workplace where everyone's too terrified to take these people to task in a political sense. So that's the only time I've seen Klobuchar and Franken is when they visited my workplace. And they did the same thing. Well, that's not entirely true. Let me take Franken first. When Franken came by, and keep in mind, in both cases, everyone's dressed in black. They look like the mafia. They come with these entourages of these interns that just look like, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses who go door to door with their ties and everything. That's what these people look like. They look like a cult. And this is their entourage for these senators. These are the pages, and they come to this workplace. They meet first with the management of your employer. And when Franken came out to talk to us after that, his speech, if you can call it that, was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I would say 50% of the words in his entire speech was the word and the reason is because he didn't have the foggiest idea what he was talking about. He didn't understand our industry at all. He didn't know anything. The only thing he knew is exactly the words that were just spoken to him moments before by our executive management. So what Franken did was he just basically repeated everything he had just been told by our management, by memory, the best he could. But he couldn't really remember it because he didn't know anything about our industry. So he's just sitting there the whole time struggling, I know that in this industry you have challenges, and then he just goes and he starts listing out all of the challenges that executive management had just told him the best he could. It was just embarrassing, his total ignorance. I mean, oh man, it was just embarrassing. One thing he did not do, he did like he does on television or in his books. He wasn't sitting there like Al Confidence, making fun of Bill O'Reilly or Rush Limbaugh or whoever he wants to attack today. Al Franken is one of the most childish people I have ever seen pretending to be an adult. That represents Minnesota very well, I mean, in terms of representation, but he's just an embarrassment to watch. But in this particular case, he wasn't like that. He was just struggling to find anything to say. It was a very short speech. All he did was do his best by memory to reiterate what he had just been told by our management moments before. It was just embarrassing. He didn't even comprehend what our industry did. He was just being lobbied. Now, when Klobuchar came by, and I'm watching these people very, very closely. Klobuchar is a much smoother operator. So what she did was, instead of just reiterating what she had been told by management, because she's not clued in any better than anyone else. She doesn't have the foggiest idea what we do either. She probably has a slightly better idea than Franken, but not much. And what she did was she tried to make it all homey. So she starts telling all these irrelevant stories. And then she actually opened it up to questions, which Franken didn't. It was only a few questions, and here's the thing. No matter what questions she was asked, and she was asked softball questions anyway, because, again, she's in a workplace. It's not like I'm going to stand up and ask her a really hard question. Why did you vote for Obamacare when that basically makes homelessness illegal? Because all of a sudden people who by definition can't even afford a place to live suddenly have to pay this ridiculous penalty with money they don't have. I mean, you basically criminalized homelessness, so that she could start dancing around the issue. Well, it's income based and blah. I can't ask those questions in my workplace. I'm going to be fired the next day. Right? So I just sat back and I watched what people did ask her, and they just asked her softball questions. But no matter what they asked her, she would take it off into this la-la land of telling these down-home stories. Sounds like something Garrison Keillor would do on Prairie Home Companion. I remember one of the stories, somehow she ended up talking about going shopping with her husband, grocery shopping. It's like, this is a United States senator at one of the few times that she's actually in front of the people she supposedly represents, and she's talking about shopping with her husband. She's not talking about issues. She's not defending the votes that she's cast in the United States Senate. And I just watched and marveled because she was very good at it. This is human manipulation. This is exactly what I've studied for 30 years, is people who are able to just dance around issues and walk a mass of adoring fans wherever they want them to go. That's exactly what Klobuchar did. It was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. And I think the only reason Franken didn't pull that off is because once he started trying to talk about our industry, as soon as he opened his mouth, he seemed to realize, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just completely oblivious. Now I'm stuck talking about this, and I have to try to remember what the executives just told me. Klobuchar was smart enough not to even do that. She didn't even bother with it. She's just telling these stories. It was ridiculous. I mean, it was a total waste of time. I could go listen to some old salt sitting by the sea tell me about the fish he caught one time and get as much political enlightenment out of it as I did from Klobuchar. And it told me that she didn't want to talk about this. And the fact that she had that gangster-looking entourage with her tells me a lot about who she is. And then I started looking into her after that. What she's done is exactly in line with what Minnesota does. Minnesota is the dominant subculture in Minnesota. It controls the government here. It is one of the reasons why Minnesota is one of the most leftist states in the country, if not the most leftist state ultimately. And with that in mind, I need to venture off into something that I only alluded to in my previous video, the Scientology Part 1. When I said that liberalism is the only cult mentality that rivals Minnesota in terms of its danger to the population in general. I should have said leftism, but the thing is, there's nowhere to draw a line between leftism, liberalism, progressivism, because they just every time someone figures out what it is, they give it a new name. I have to talk about the difference between the left and the right, and I don't want to because it's going to sound to you like I'm being political, but I'm not. I'm analyzing this in terms of cult mentality. They're both cult mentalities. And if you remember my working definition of a cult mentality, it is when people take all those intellectual skills that they have, their ability to conduct competent research, their knowledge of history to learn the lessons of history, their critical thinking skills, their ability to understand logic. You take all of those skills and you just throw them in the toilet and flush them in favor of some prepackaged answer, like an ideology or the pronouncements of a cult leader. That's what a cult mentality is, and that is both conservatism and liberalism. But what makes liberalism so dangerous, where conservatism is not that dangerous, goes back to the original split that created the left and the right. And unfortunately, people don't understand where that came from. They think that the split came from issues like abortion and gay rights and welfare and gun control and things like that. That's not where the split between left and right came from. Those are consequences of the split. The split came from one simple thing that has been an issue in politics since ancient Greece. I mean, it's always been. This is the fundamental difference in political views of the world. Any government has only one purpose domestically, ultimately. It has one overriding function, and that is to manage resources versus population. And it's just like SimCity, that video game. That's all you do. You're managing the resources and the population, trying to keep the population happy. And you know how that goes if you've ever played that game. You cut taxes and your population's happy. You get reelected. But then suddenly a storm comes and blows away half your town, and you don't have enough money to rebuild it, so you have to raise taxes, and everyone gets mad at you. And it's just that is the fundamental game that politics and government has to play. Where left versus right originated from, and it will always originate in any government, it has to, unless you have a totalitarian dictatorship which doesn't allow it. Where it comes from is there's two schools of thought. You can either focus on managing the resources, or you can focus on managing the population. Very few people are, how do I put this? I want to say smart enough, but I'm not trying to insult people, but very few people are competent enough to truly sit there in the middle and manage both population and resources. Most people lean toward blaming the population or blaming the resources, or looking at the resources as their salvation, or looking at the population as their salvation. What happens when you focus on the resources is you tend to go to the right, what we call the right. You go toward conservatism. And resources come from things like farming and manufacturing, research and development, land development. So you're talking about things like real estate, you're talking about finance, and of course that brings you up into areas like the Federal Reserve, Wall Street and stock market, the banksters, oil. That's when you're dealing with resources, that's what they tend to focus on, and that's why they're called the right. That's why they have a term that sets them apart from the other people. They tend to focus on managing resources, and their goal, ultimately, in a pure conservative sense, would be to manage the resources to bring them up so that they are enough resources for the full population. However, the people who ignore the resources and they focus on the people instead, they are kind of stuck with whatever resources are available, and they have to somehow try to pigeonhole a population into being supported by those resources. But what if the resources are woefully insufficient? There isn't much you can do except split things evenly among people so that the population is barely surviving, standing around in bread lines, or another option is to just slaughter a large number of your population. Okay, and that's why the left traditionally is the end of the political spectrum that is behind mass murder and slaughter of government's own populations. Communist China to the left, 80 million or so Chinese killed by their own government. Soviet Union, left, communist. Stalin killed about 50 million Russians. Nazi Germany. Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. Socialist is the same left spectrum as communism, Marxism. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's a focus on the population, controlling the population rather than controlling the resources. Any of those ideologies on the left are focusing on the population. When you're dealing with people who want to control other people, what does that tend to attract into government? That attracts people who like to control other people. It attracts megalomaniacs, it attracts sociopaths, it attracts psychopaths, it attracts dictators, it attracts people who want to be little gods. That's what it attracts. And that's why they end up slaughtering huge numbers of their people. Now, think about that carefully. This is what I meant when I said that all those other issues come out of this fundamental split between left and right. Take the issue of guns. If you're on the left and one of your available options for managing the population to match your resources is to change the number of your population, for example, by slaughtering them or by imprisoning them in a gulag system or something like that. You can't do that if the population is armed, because they're going to defend themselves and they're going to fight back. That's why the left is always in favor of gun control. It isn't that if you're in favor of gun control, you're on the left. It's if you're on the left, you have to be in favor of gun control. You have to be. Because you can't do what you're doing on the left unless you have a disarmed population. Because you have to leave that option open that you need to, shall we say, manually reduce the population size if there aren't enough resources. Because the people who focus on increasing your resources are, by definition, on the right. So it's not so much that people on the right are in favor of guns, it's that they don't pursue gun control because it doesn't have anything to do with how they're trying to address the fundamental issue of managing resources versus population. It has nothing to do with it. On the right, you get something similar but not nearly as dangerous. On the right, because they're focused on resources, they, like I said, they get tied up in things like the Federal Reserve and finances, Wall Street, stock market, oil, natural resources, research and development, corporations. That's why the right tends to be associated with things like corporations that become psychopathic in their own right. They become domineering of their employees. The robber barons, the Carnegies and the J.P. Morgans and all those guys. That tends to be associated with the right because they're concerned with increasing the amount of resources and wealth to match the population that they have and the projected population in the future. So the right tends to focus on things like that, and of course, everything becomes corrupt. They're both cult mentalities. I'm not here to praise conservatism or capitalism. I'm just saying that when you're dealing with conservatism and capitalism, it is not incumbent upon them to take away people's freedom or to take away their guns, for example. They don't need to do that to do what they're trying to do. So on the right, generally, your population remains free and armed enough to overthrow these people if they ever get out of hand. On the left, that isn't the case, because on the left, these people are obsessively preoccupied with the people. They're preoccupied with the population. Well, what's another way of reducing the population? Birth control, Planned Parenthood, abortion. You see, they need to manage the size of the population because they're not even concerned with raising the amount of resources out there. In fact, their policies make it harder to increase your resources. You can't, I mean, well, that's another whole other story, but they're focused on people, not resources, right? So that's why abortion, Planned Parenthood, all of that, birth control tends to be associated with the left. It isn't that if you're in favor of abortion rights, if you want to call it that, that puts you on the left. It's that the only side of that political spectrum that has to have abortion as a matter of the way that it manages government is the left. Now, it's not to say someone on the right can't be in favor of what they call abortion rights. They might have it. That's another ideology. I believe that people should have the right to have an abortion. It's like, okay, whatever. That's your belief. That's your conscience. You can have people on the right who feel that way. What I'm saying is that there's nothing incumbent upon them on the right to have that because it's irrelevant. Abortion is concerned with population control, and people on the right aren't concerned with that. They're concerned with resource control. But the people on the left have to manage people. And the only way you can manage people is to dominate people, to manipulate people, to take control over people. And that's why the left and communism, Marxism, socialism, Nazism, all of those leftist ideologies are always about controlling and dominating people. People, people, people. They don't care about the resources. In fact, as I said, I mean, this is a whole other story, but what they do actually almost guarantees that your resources are going to, if not just taper off even, they're going to become scarce. That's why when you think of breadlines and such like that, you're usually dealing with something like the Soviet Union. You're dealing with a leftist government, right? This is the fundamental split between right and left, and I don't, gosh, I'm already into it so much. I don't want to get into this too much because it starts to sound political, but I'm honestly not being political here. There's huge problems on the right. In fact, I spent most of my time in Third World American fighting against what you might call the right, or conservatives, or capitalism. But in the end, after 10 years of being on the ground in there, I had to recognize that that isn't the problem. The fundamental problem is the cult mentality that creates this right versus left mentality and where that naturally leads. The right leads in a direction that can become oppressive. It can be very oppressive. I mean, if you've worked in a corporation lately, you know how oppressive it can be. But the thing is, you can overthrow that if you're free and if you're armed. But on the left, where they take away your freedom and they take away your arms, and when I say freedom, I'm not talking about like Patriot Act, which came out of the neoconservatives. I'm talking about government taking control over every little detail of your life, taxing you everywhere you go, to the point where whether or not you can have your own small business depends on whether you're able to meet all of the government's demands. That's a government taking control over you, nitpicking every little thing. You have to be a certain age to drink this. You have to be a certain age to smoke that. You're not allowed to drink or smoke or eat this at all. When a government starts doing that, they are taking control over your lives. That is as totalitarian as it gets. And that tends to lean to the left because they're dealing with people. They're trying to control people. On the right, they generally don't care what you eat, you drink, you smoke, or at what age you do it. I mean, they might care, but I mean, it isn't incumbent upon them. They don't need to in order to do what they're trying to do on the right. They might have a belief, this right-winger might have a belief that people should not be able to drink until they're such and such age. But another right-winger says, I don't care when they drink. They should be free to do what they want. That's their parents' job to deal with that, not the government's. Because it doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with resource management. On the left, it has everything to do with population management. Now, the point of all this that I'm talking about is that Minnesota is, if not the most liberal leftist state in the union, it is one of them. And it helps you to understand, I mean, it really couldn't be any other way, because Minnesota is a vicious, mean cult that has no problem utterly destroying outsiders. That's the point of what I've been saying about Minnesota all along. It will destroy them. It will kill them. They are murdering me right now. As I sit in this car, I am hungry, I'm cold, and I don't have any resources, and they have outlawed everything I need to do to gain the resources. You see, they're controlling the people. They're controlling me. They've taken away all my rights and freedom that I need to go out and do what I need to do. I have to have a permanent address to do this. I have to fill out this form and give my private information to this agency to just be considered for that. And then, of course, after I give them all that, which they can use against me later, they say, sorry, you're not eligible. And I've just wasted all that time and given them all this information. You know, right-wingers don't do that. Right-wingers tend to basically leave that kind of thing to the private sector, you know, churches. And that's why in other states, churches generally help out people in my situation. But in Minnesota, I've gone to more than 100 churches, and they've done nothing, absolutely nothing. The only thing they ever do is send me to the government. This leftist, basically communist, socialist government in Minnesota. And a state that is dominated by a mean-spirited cult like Minnesota can't go any direction but to the left. It has to, because it's all about controlling other people. That's what cults do. They control other people. They're not concerned with resource management. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Minnesota made the news nationally because the government shut down, because these people are utterly incompetent at managing resources. They're just totally incompetent. So, you know, what did they do? They jacked up the tobacco taxes, the cigarette prices. I mean, really jacked them up, apparently, like, I think $2 or $3 or something. Well, you have like 1 million tobacco users in Minnesota, and let's say they smoke a pack a day. That's 1 million packs sold a day that the taxes have increased on $2 or $3. And that's in addition to what they're already getting. That's another $2 or $3 million a day that the government just conjures up out of thin air. Not by managing resources, but by managing people. By saying, you're now going to pay us. And in Minnesota, because there's a lot of hatred toward tobacco users, real hatred, like the kind of stuff you see in Mississippi, the way they treated blacks in the 60s, that's the way smokers are treated in Minnesota, because it's all founded on hatred. Again, cult mentalities. So they have no problem just saying, well, here's a group we hate, why don't we just steal another $2 or $3 from them every day? And that's what they did. And guess what? The next year after the government shut down, suddenly they had a surplus. And then they come out and they say, see, look, we know what we're doing. Our liberal government knows how to manage resources. We've got this surplus. And it's like, hold it, you were bankrupt a year ago. You shut down, for heaven's sakes. You humiliated the whole country in front of the rest of the world by shutting down your state government. And the only way you could get out of it was finding a subpopulation of yours that you hate, and then you raise taxes on them. And now you're out there bragging about how you have all this. You see what I'm getting at, though? They didn't manage resources. They managed the people. They took a group that they hated, and they taxed them. And, that, of course, that hurts them, because they're losing all this money unnecessarily. And then look what they ended up doing with it. They ended up, in the same session that they raised those tobacco taxes, the legislature voted to raise their own salaries 30%. This is during what they called the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Well, where do you think the money, I mean, if it's a bankrupt government, where's the money going to come from to raise their salaries like that? Obviously, they expected tobacco users to pay for it. Now, that got thwarted because there was actually, for once, an outcry of people who recognized the obvious, that was just a reprehensible, that was a demonic act. That wasn't just wrong. They called it's the wrong timing. No, it wasn't the wrong timing. It was demonic. They took a group of people who they hate, who they want to destroy, smokers, and they tax them, and then they said, we're going to raise our salaries and pay for it with these taxes from this group that we hate, because we as the government can stick a gun to their head and say, you will give us an extra 2 or 3 or however much it was per pack, right? The right doesn't tend to do that. The right doesn't want to go with taxes and stick a gun to your head. They would do something else. They would say, like, well, we can't afford all these government programs, so we're going to have to shut some of them down. So it's as simple as that. We can't afford it. We're not going to go out and steal money from some group that we hate. We just don't have enough money. We're going to have to shut it down. But that's the way Minnesota is. It's based on this cult mentality, and cults usually have an us and them attitude. And one of the us and them attitudes you see is their view toward smokers. They hate smokers. They hate them. The Tobacco Master Settlement of all the states, where all the states, unconstitutionally I might add, ganged up together to file these lawsuits against the tobacco industry. And they strong-armed the tobacco industry into making admissions that may or may not even be true, but they didn't have any choice. And that's unconstitutional. Our Constitution says that when the states have an issue collectively, that's where the federal government's supposed to come in and deal with it. You don't have all the states come in and gang up on an industry and basically run it out of business, or what they did in this case, just steal all their money. I mean, a pack of cigarettes should probably cost $1.50 a pack. In some states, they cost over $10. In Minnesota, they're probably close to that, right? So the question is, where's that other $6 or $7 going? Well, that's what the government stole in the Master Tobacco Settlement, and that originated in Minnesota, because Minnesotans hate smokers, and Minnesota is dominated by a cult. Minnesota, when you're dealing with a cult, you're dealing with an us and them attitude. You are an outsider. We hate you. Therefore, we are going to steal from you. We're going to exploit you. We're going to dominate you and control you. We're going to destroy you. And the rest of the states jumped on that bandwagon because there was so much money in it with the Master Tobacco Settlement. Okay, now getting back to the original topic of this, the idea of Amy Klobuchar being on the U.S. Supreme Court. Amy Klobuchar comes out of that sick and twisted Minnesota legal system that I've been talking about all along. I have a page on it on my website. I raise this issue all the time, and I call it the sick and twisted Minnesota legal system for a reason. It is sick and it is twisted. And people are suggesting that she should go on the Supreme Court, where you can't remove her. Someone who represents the most vicious cult in the United States of America should be put on the Supreme Court, not just put there, but at a time when it's equally balanced. And if she's put on there, it's going to suddenly lean way to the left. And as I just said, the left is the dangerous side. It's the side that leans toward taking control over the population's lives, every little detail of their life. You can only swim between these 2 hours. This is the kind of thing that in Islam would require women to wear a burqa, cover up your heads. That is micromanaging someone's life on a ridiculous scale. That's what liberalism does. It has to, because it isn't concerned with resources. It's concerned when a problem between resources and population arises, they look at the population. What can we do? Can we control them? Can we tax them? Can we force them, ultimately at gunpoint, to do this, that, or the other thing? Can we slaughter them? Can we imprison them? Can we, for example, let's say marijuana was never illegal. Okay? Today, tobacco. Okay, they've already made marijuana illegal. Now they're trying to make it legal. Tobacco's legal. What if you made tobacco illegal? Of course, that would create black markets. You would still have people smoking. Then you can throw those people in prison. Guess what? You've just changed the whole dynamics of the population. And if you do it right, it can match the resources that we have available. Because leftists aren't concerned with changing the resources. This is the whole point. In fact, all those people in prison now, because they were smoking cigarettes, they can't contribute to the economy to help create more resources anymore. Do you see how this works? This all originates with that fundamental split. Right versus left is what we call it. It doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it versus. It doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't matter. Left, right, liberal, conservative. The point is, in this fundamental purpose of government, managing population versus resources, do you focus on managing the resources, or do you focus on controlling and dominating the people? And what we call the right focuses on resources. What we call the left focuses on the people. That's why they're the more dangerous one. That's why all the ones that lean to the left have always slaughtered their people when they get the chance. Once they get them disarmed and they've taken enough control over them, if they need to, or if you get a maniac, a paranoid maniac in charge, they just slaughter their people. And voila, overnight, your population size matches your available resources. Problem solved, right? If you consider that problem solving. That's the kind of person they're talking about putting on the Supreme Court when they suggest putting Amy Klobuchar there. Now, she can go out with this, oh, yeah, you betcha, Minnesota twang and tell stories about her and her husband going grocery shopping. She can do that all day long. But there's something far more sinister going on there. She represents the most dangerous cult in the United States of America. I urge everyone to think very carefully about what I said. Do your damnedest, please. I'm going to just ask you as a fellow citizen, as a brother, as a fellow American, please, just this once, try to let your cult mentality go for a moment. If you're a left-leaning liberal, try to let it go for a moment, just for a moment, please. If you're a right-wing, neo-conservative, try to let it go for a moment and just think about what I just said. Okay? Not in terms of politics. Don't look at me as an enemy because I don't agree with your political leanings. And I won't because I'm not on either side. They're both cults. Try to look at it in terms of cult mentality and try to understand what I just said. Look at the lessons of history, both in the United States and all around the world. In the 20th century, the supposedly enlightened technological age, more people were killed by their governments than probably in all of human history combined times some factor. And that's just in the last century. And they were all liberal, socialist, Marxist, communist, whatever you want to call it, that did that. So please, just try to ignore the politics of the matter. Try not to take political offense to what I'm saying. I don't care what your political leanings are. I care about whether or not people are moving towards a form of government where they are going to be controlled and dominated and ultimately slaughtered if necessary. That's what bothers me. Because it doesn't matter. There's no point to their existence if they're not free and independent. It's better to be free and suffering than to have everything provided for you and to have no purpose to your existence, except to exist until the day you die and then it's over. And you did nothing but sit there and let some government hand you everything. Or you got shot by the government because you were in the way. They needed your resources to give to someone else. That's a pointless existence. Please, people, think about what I'm saying here. I apologize profusely that this is more or less stream of consciousness. I'm sitting in a car in the middle of the night because Minnesota, the dominant subculture of Minnesota, the cult that is represented by Amy Klobuchar and Al Franken, they were elected by this cult to be their representatives. That cult destroyed my entire life. Everything I worked my entire life for. They don't even apologize for it. They won't even talk about it. They fight tooth and nail to make sure nobody learns about it. And they are content to watch me sit here and just die. That is what they're talking about putting on the Supreme Court when they talk about putting Amy Klobuchar on the Supreme Court. Because, brother and sister, Amy Klobuchar hasn't done a damn thing to help me get out of this car and get my life back. She hasn't done a damn thing, despite her role in the sick and twisted Minnesota legal system, to bring about anything that resembles justice like putting my landlord in prison or holding him accountable for breaking his contract, or holding the police department accountable for refusing to enforce the law for me when they enforce that same law for other people who they like more than they like me because I'm an outsider. Amy Klobuchar hasn't done a damn thing there. And the reason is because she doesn't care. She doesn't give a damn. I'm an outsider of the cult of Minnesota. And guess what? So are you, unless you're one of those people in Minnesota who's a part of that cult mentality. So if she gets on the Supreme Court, you can expect the same concern for your well-being as I'm getting right now as I record this at 2:08 in the morning in the freezing cold winter, living in a car after losing everything I worked my entire life for. I worked hard and I worked honestly for that stuff. And it meant a lot to me. I was trying to use that stuff to pursue goals that would be my legacy in this world when I was gone. I was going to use it to produce, recordings and books and things of that nature that I could leave behind as evidence that I ever existed. And instead, I'm sitting here in a car waiting to die, and nobody's ever going to know that I existed now, except for these videos I put on YouTube, which are on something I wish I never had to talk about. Minnesota. People out there, listen to what I'm saying. I speak with an authority that you cannot comprehend. And if you don't comprehend it, then read my website, Minnesota.com, watch my videos, and learn what kind of authority I have. I made absolutely certain that I did nothing wrong and that I did everything right to the extent that it was possible at all. And I documented it to make sure that no one could accuse me of doing anything other than doing the right thing. And yet, my entire life was destroyed. I'm sitting in a car, and people like, I just told you, Attorney General Swanson in the state of Minnesota didn't even respond to the letter I sent. And it was one hell of an important letter. It is the kind of letter that you do answer, period. When you find out what's in that letter, you're going to know what I'm talking about. She didn't even respond to it. That's how much they care whether people who are outside of their cult of Minnesota live or die. And that cult elected as their representative Amy Klobuchar, Al Franken. The idea of either of those people sitting on the Supreme Court, well, Franken wouldn't, he's not an attorney, but the idea of Klobuchar sitting on the Supreme Court should scare the living crap out of you people. Listen to what I'm saying, look into it, and get on the phone, get on your email, get on your typewriter, and start inundating your representatives in Congress to make sure that this doesn't happen. If you ever give a Minnesotan that kind of power in this country, you only need to look at my bones, because that's all I'm going to be by then, is a bunch of bones in the ground. Well, I won't even be that, because what they do with people like me in Minnesota, well, really anywhere, but what they do with people like me who have become homeless and lost absolutely everything, they just cremate them and bury them in a mass grave. They do it with what they call dignity. So I won't even have bones to serve as a testimony that I ever existed. I can't tell you how offended I am that that newspaper even suggested that Amy Klobuchar should serve on the United States Supreme Court. Please, people, listen to what I'm saying. If there was ever a time that people needed to start analyzing this country in terms of its cult mentalities that overlap all over the place, now is the time. And frankly, if you ever want to try to resolve this left versus right, this gulf that exists between the left and the right where they just can't seem to get along and you don't see how they can ever get along, I'm telling you right now, the only hope we ever have for those people ever getting along is if they start looking at their ideologies in terms of cult mentalities instead of as some kind of political difference. Because as long as we look at it as a political difference, they're going to remain polarized and fighting against each other instead of fighting together and cooperating together for the benefit of everybody. But if they start recognizing in all humility that they have immersed themselves in these cult mentalities on the left and on the right, then possibly in that same humility they'll be able to bring themselves a little closer and actually get the job done of saving this country from being destroyed forever. Because that's where we're headed. And if you can't just look around 360 degrees around you and figure that out, that we are on our way down into the bit bucket of history unless we start getting some sane and stable, non-cult aligned people in our government, then hit the stop button. I don't even need to talk to you if that's what you think. But for the rest of you, look at who Amy Klobuchar is. Look at what she represents. A leftist state, Minnesota, that when it needs money, it just goes and steals it from a subpopulation of its own people who it hates. It just personally hates something that they do. In this case, smoking. In the next case, what? What's it going to be? It could be anything. All right? But they look for a group they hate, and they tax them, and all of a sudden they have a budget surplus. You know what they use that money for? To build a football stadium for the privately owned Minnesota Vikings. A privately owned company. So they rob all these smokers, at gunpoint, ultimately at gunpoint, by the way, and then they use it to buy a football stadium for a privately owned football team. And then all those smokers who paid for it aren't allowed to smoke in the stadium that their taxes paid for. That's what the left does. It is inherently inhumane. It has to be inhumane because they're totally focused on dominating, controlling, managing people. And that's one reason why the left has done so much to take control of our education system. And that is why our education system has produced so many ignoramuses. For example, people who don't know that the Nazis were liberals. That's why, because the liberals took control of the education system. So now students grow up thinking that the Nazis were right-wingers. That's the polar opposite of reality. National Socialist Workers' Party. That's why none of these, even college graduates in Minnesota, know what the Soviet Union was. Because liberals don't want them to know that Stalin slaughtered 50 million of his own people once he had the chance, once he got them disarmed. They don't want them to know that. But the right, people on the right, they don't care. It doesn't matter if you know what the Soviet Union did or not, because that's not what the right does. The right's concerned with managing resources. All right, I'm just going out of control here. I don't want to put this kind of stream of consciousness video online, but the fact is I've got to speak out and I've got to say something. If we allow Klobuchar on the Supreme Court, you are not going to get some down-home housewife who tells, cute little stories about her and her husband going shopping on the Supreme Court. That's not what you're getting. You're getting the elected representative of the most dangerous cult in the United States of America on the United States Supreme Court. And that's the final thought I'm going to leave you with. It's up to you whether you want to read my website, Meannesota.com, and watch my other videos to learn in depth what I'm talking about there. But friends, they've already killed me. I'm just waiting to die. You're the ones who are going to have to experience the sheer horror of what will happen if someone like her gets on the Supreme Court. So again, it's up to you whether you want to look into it or if you just want to say, I disagree with what you think are my politics, and blow this off. It's up to you. But you know what? You're going to get what you pay for. That's all I have to say in this video. Thanks, everyone.